Good morning. The quorum appears to be present. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Actuarial Committee of the Pension Review Board. Ms. Seymour, would you please call the roll?
Chair Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Marcia Dutch. Here. Stephanie Lighty. Here.
Thank you. We are all here. Thank you for coming. First item of business is consideration of possible action to approve the July 27th, 2023 meeting minutes, and I would entertain a motion to suspend the reading minutes.
I move. Second.
Moved by Ms. Dush, second by Ms. Lighty. During discussion, the motion is to suspend the reading of the minutes. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Ayes have it. Minutes will not be read and are approved as provided. Second order of business is public comment. If anybody has public comments, this is your opportunity. Please come forward. Seeing and hearing no one, I would close this item and let's move on to item 5, the update on Dallas Police and Fire Pension System, including actuarial analysis required by section 2.025, article 6243A1 of Vernon's Texas Civil Statutes. A few introductory comments, please. The board and this committee received updates last year on the procurement of an independent actuary for the review of the Dallas Police and Fire Pension System. Is required by statute. Ultimately, the PRB selected Chiron to serve as the independent actuary. The purpose of this agenda item is to hear a progress update on the system's funding and a high-level summary of Chiron's work in developing its recommendations. We understand the system, city, and Chiron have been working hard on this review and to improve the system's funding, and appreciate everyone who has traveled today to provide this update. The committee and board will stay engaged on this issue throughout the year going forward. And at this time, I would like to call, please, on Kelly Gottschalk, Executive Director of the Dallas Police and Fire Pension System, Jack Ireland, Chief Financial Officer for the City of Dallas, and Bill Hallmark and Elizabeth Wiley, representatives on behalf of Chiron, to provide remarks to the committee. Please find a place at the table. And before you begin, I'd like to make a few comments of my own. I want to thank those of you who are coming out from Dallas and from provide testimony to this committee. We appreciate your interest in helping develop a resolution to the pension funding challenges that face the City of Dallas and the Dallas Police and Fire Pension. Funding challenges the fund faces are the result of years of poor governance, poor decisions made by multiple entities, including the legislature, city, and the pension fund. No one person or group is to blame, and assigning fault would be a waste of time. Pension Review Board is tasked with monitoring the actuarial soundness of public pensions in the state. We do not have the authority to enforce an action. We cannot choose sides. We can listen, encourage, advise, and sympathize, but the power to fix this problem lies with the city and the fund. If you are unable to come to an agreement to fix the problem, the legislature will do the job. The city and the fund must understand and accept that you are a single unit. You need each other. The pension plan needs the city to provide funding and to support the promises that have been made to active and retired police officers and firefighters. The city needs the pension plan to maintain the records, invest the assets, and pay the benefits. You are dependent on one another. Collaborating with one another might be uncomfortable, but it must happen if you are going to solve this problem yourselves. The sooner the city and the fund can get on the same page, the closer we will be to resolution. And with that, I would like to open it up to those who come to us. You all selected an order of speaking. Who goes first?
I think we go first.
Okay, could you please introduce yourself for the record? I'm sure all of you are speaking to the microphone. Mr. Hallmark.
My name is Bill Hallmark. I'm a consulting actuary with Chiron, and with me is Elizabeth Wiley, also a consulting actuary. We provided a presentation that we had given to the city ad hoc committee and to the retirement system, and we thought we would go through an abbreviated version of that presentation for you, although we're happy to take questions on any points. Just an update. So if we could go to slide 4. Just very quickly, the process we're going through. We started with their 2022 valuation, we replicated it, built our models in this preliminary draft presentation based on the 2022 valuation. So that's what we are going to go through today. Since then, we have finished replicating the 2023 valuation, and we're in the process of updating our recommendations based on that. So now, if we could slide to slide 6. In developing our recommendations, we tried to balance 3 competing objectives. We think the system needs to have secure benefits that are adequate. We want a structure that has predictable contributions that are stable and sustainable for the sponsors, and some generational equity. The idea of generational equity is that the taxpayers who receive the services should pay for the benefits attributable to the employees who provided those services. Obviously, in this case, we've fallen far enough behind that a pure form of generational equity is not possible. So the question now is, how do we spread that cost over the future generations and recover full funding? So with that, let's go to slide 9 that covers how we implemented that. In particular, we looked at the benefits. The benefit levels need to be competitive, not too high, not too low. And I'm not going to go through it here, but there are slides in here showing comparisons to other police and fire systems in Texas. The contributions need to be sufficient to meet the funding guidelines. And we think automatic adjustment mechanisms could come up with a plan that would meet funding guidelines right now, but that doesn't guarantee that we'll meet the funding guidelines tomorrow or next year or the year after. So we think we need a structure that will make sure that they can continue to meet the funding guidelines. The current structure for the COLA, once they're 70% funded, does provide some adjustment mechanism, but since they're not 70% funded, it's already adjusted to 0 and expected to remain 0 for a long period of time. We do believe both member and city contributions need to adjust to the circumstances. And then finally, we do recognize that we probably can't make a radical change all at once. So we should recognize that we may need to step into or grade into our ultimate. So with that, I'm going to jump forward to slide 17. So this slide kind of summarizes the recommendations we made. We looked at the 5 areas: the city contributions, employee contributions, COLA, the benefit multiplier, retirement age. Based on our comparisons to other systems, we're not recommending any changes to the benefit multiplier or retirement age. So those would remain the same. Our primary recommendation is that the city's contribution be based on an actuarially determined contribution. We have a specific recommendation here, but that fundamental principle is that it should be based on actuarially determined contribution that will adjust as circumstances change. We've suggested a layered amortization approach that grades up over a short period and then back down at the end of 3 years. So we'll talk in more detail about that. We also saw the current employee contribution was adjusted upward because of the situation. We understand that, but it is a very high percentage of the normal cost. and higher than what we see across the state. When the plan is fully funded, it would switch back to 50% of normal costs. Proposals just to provide a mechanism that doesn't step down all at once, but rates down. And then on the COLA, the concern we have with the COLA is there's a long period of time no COLA provided. And these numbers are not covered by Social Security. So this is the only retirement. We're not sure how sustainable it is to provide no COLA for that much time. COLAs are expensive. So we're looking for a way to provide some level of COLA at relatively low cost. So that's what we've come up with here is one idea on a possible partial COLA. So if we skip to slide 19, just wanted to spend a minute on the amortization schedule we're proposing, actuarially determined contribution. We would start with two amortization bases that are built separately. So the first amortization base is just a 30-year amortization that mimics the current contribution rate that the city is making. So they're currently making a 34.5% of pay contribution plus a fixed dollar amount of $13 million. And so that equates to about, as I recall, about 37%. So we set that initial base, which is shown here in the dark green bars, as a basic 30-year amortization with 2.5% increases each year. That's the plan's inflation assumption and payroll growth assumption. Then the second piece covers the remainder of the unfunded liability that's not paid for by that first base. And we're proposing an amortization structure that steps up over a short period. What we've illustrated here is a 5-year step up to a full rate, and then a step down at the end of the amortization. The step up is to accommodate budget adjustments so that you can build in those steps each year into the budget, you know what they are in advance. By doing that step up, you do have to step up to a higher rate than you would if you did not do the step up. Similarly, the step down, it is to accommodate an adjustment out of the temporary high rates at the end of the amortization. If we go to the next slide, the main thing we wanted to convey here is that the current structure is built as a percentage of pay. And the normal cost, the cost of benefits attributable to the next year of service, is designed to be a level percentage of pay. And the amount you need to collect actually varies with payroll. So if they add 300 new employees covered, we would need to collect normal costs based on their pay to cover benefits they're accruing. The UAL is different. If they add 300 employees, it doesn't change the amount we need of the UAL. Or if they lay off 300 employees. So it's not really tied to payroll. And so our proposal is to split the city's contribution into two pieces, a normal cost piece that's based on payroll and a UAL payment that is a fixed dollar schedule. It adjusts each year as an actuarially determined contribution, but it's set as a dollar amount. It's independent of what the actual payroll is.
Mr. Hallmark,
Yes.
under that scenario, does that pay the full ADC?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Homer,
Yes.
why on your graphs between the 2025 current and the 2025 recommended, why is the normal cost going up?
Excellent. So in the current evaluation, with the contributions coming in. The plan is not scheduled to reach 70% funded for quite some time. And so the COLA is assumed to be zero because there's no COLA payable until there's 70%. COLA is assumed to be zero until it's 2072 or something like that. That results in a lower normal cost than if we accelerate the contributions. The COLA becomes payable in the 2040s. So you see here, we're projecting the COLA to be payable around 2046 with the revised contribution schedule. And so that increases the normal cost. It's a complex dynamic that's built into
It's a
the structure.
substantial.
It is.
So projecting we will pay a COLA in 2046 rather than 72 increases the normal cost by 130 basis.
Yes. So if we go to the next slide, this is the contribution and liability projection for that scenario with the graded actuarially determined contribution. On the left side, you'll see a chart with gray bars. That's the actuarial liability growing, and the teal line is the projected value of assets. The percentages are the funded percentage. These projections were based on the 2022 valuation with assumed investment loss of 13%, 6.5%. So we're seeing the first COLA paid around 2047 when they're projected to exceed 70% funding. Right-hand side, the purple bars are the member contributions, which are just fixed at 13.5%. The gold bars are the city contribution, which start out at about 39.5% and grade up to 54%, staying there for about 25 years and then grading down 4 years. It's when the UAL is projected to be fully paid off, then they're 100% funded, drops substantially.
Mr. Palmer, one more question here. You have the funded status on the first chart going from 41 to 31. And you said you've replicated the 2023 valuation. Is that what comes out of the 2023 valuation?
It's slightly higher. It's about 33%.
So that's really
Yes.
a tough number. Is that very frightening?
In my presentation, I plan on talking a little bit about the highlights of the.
Okay, great.
So then we wanted to provide some sense of what happens when if the investment returns are different from assumed. And these are not meant to be predictions, kind of extreme scenarios to give a sense of what happens and how sensitive these are to investment. So the chart on the left-hand side is showing contributions, assuming there's a -1% return for 2023 through 2027. And on the right-hand side, 14% return. It's 6.5% returns. Teal line was the baseline contribution rate with 6.5% returns through the entire. So you can see on the left-hand chart, it has to grade up.
Bill, excuse me, are you on the next slide?
I'm sorry, yes, I have. There we go.
Can you please start over with the
Yes,
discussion?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So the left-hand chart has investment returns 2023 through 2027 at -1%. And the right-hand chart has 14% for that period. And it's 6.5% thereafter. The teal line is what we showed on the prior chart with 6.5% returns through that whole period. So this is just intended to give you a sense of the sensitivity of the contributions when we go to the actuarially determined contribution. So you can see on the left-hand side, the contributions during that step-up period adjust immediately, starting immediately with those returns, and ultimately get to a higher contribution rate of 60% of pay. And then the pattern looks very similar. On the right-hand side, the step-up starts adjusting and actually goes down after that period as the good returns continue for that full 5-year period. And we end up with contributions around 45%. So there are, if you adopt an actuarially determined contribution, the contributions are not going to be just fixed. They are going to adjust, and they're going to adjust immediately with actual or adjustment returns.
Mr. Hallmark, I have a question. I assume this plan has negative non-adjustment cash flow. Okay, so the comment that I would just like to make is it's really important to know, or it's really important the fact that while we may get average returns, it's important to know the down years versus the up years. And the more down years you have up front, the harder it is to make it back, because you end up diminishing your asset base. It's just harder to crawl out of the hole.
Yeah, so I would agree with you that the caveat I think is with these higher contributions, the negative cash flow is much smaller than it's currently. So it becomes a much less of an issue. But still, over the long term, the actual investment returns will have. All right, I'm going to turn it to Elizabeth. If we can go to the next slide.
So in the next slide, we're building on that, but changing the employee contribution so that we're grading down to the normal cost, 50% being paid by the members that are in the new tier. This is actually similar to what's in the current law, except in the current law, it's further out and it's a cliff drop. And so we're recommending gradually dropping the rate as we go. And initially, we are leaving the rate at the current rate, because while it is quite high given the funded situation, decreasing it would be challenging. And we show here what the adjustments that we're proposing are for gradually decreasing the rate for these new members that are receiving the lower benefits. So we got on the next slide. We show the information again. These graphs are the same as we saw before, with the liabilities and assets on the left and the contributions on the right. Here, the goal is pretty similar in terms of period. It's 1 year later at the 2047. And the city contribution is, we don't have the field locked by on there, but we're relatively in kind of the same general structure, but you can see in the purple bars at the bottom that decline. And so that table that we showed on the prior slide, you can just kind of visually see the contribution coming down, and it's coming down reflecting two things. One is the drop in the rates as we're gradually phasing down to the 50% of normal costs, and the other is having more members that are in the newer tier with the lower benefits. Go on to scenario 3.
So the last scenario is the partial COLAs. And I just want to reiterate some of the reasoning for exploring this. The current COLA is not expected to be paid till 2047 under this plan. And obviously actual returns will vary that date somewhat. The members are not covered by Social Security, so they do not have any adjustment mechanism that protects them from actual inflation. And so we're talking about an additional 20-25 years before there's a COLA paid, and there's been no COLA paid since 2017. So the idea of getting some level of COLA earlier to provide some adjustment for cost of living is appealing, but COLAs are expensive. So we came up with this option where instead of providing a cliff at 70%, that we use the COLA formula they have, but apply the funded percentage to the formula, so that if you're 50% funded, you only pay 50% of the COLA that would otherwise be paid. And so that does give you some COLA earlier. There are questions about how meaningful that lower COLA is, but it does provide some COLA earlier. It provides a lower COLA once you get to 70%. So if we go to the next slide, actually, where the chart here shows funded ratio across the bottom and what the expected COLA would be under the two scenarios. So the green is the partial COLA. It starts out small and low funded ratios and grows to be the expected 1.5% COLA. Whereas the blue is what they're currently providing, which is no COLA until you get to 70%. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the cost implications. Because this is still using the actuarially determined contribution, we still get to 100% funding in 2055, but the contribution rate goes up to about 57%. And holds there for the period instead of 54%. So there is an additional cost. So you can go to the next slide, which has our summary. And I'll just stop.
Other questions for Cairo and representatives?
I guess I would just like to first compliment that I think that there's some very clever, very imaginative ideas that are forth here. But at 32 or 33% funded, even a 30% of the normal COLA seems to be unrealistic at the trust. And I mean, Chair Brainerd talked about the fact that the city and the fund have to work together. To me, if a COLA is really necessary, then I think it has to be funded outside of the trust. It just has to be paid by the city. Without, you can't afford to deteriorate the funded status.
Well, we are, if you adopt the COLA, then there would be additional funding. Net cash flow early years. You could look at accelerating the acquisition for COLA. We would agree that at 33% funding, faster we get funds into the plan, the better. Regardless.
Can you remind me what, I'm sorry.
I was gonna, that one other thing is while we're adding some liability with it, it's really not like adding all the liability. One thing in the graph that showed the COLAs that were none and then the cliff is going is we're kind of removing the period in which the COLAs are paid. And part of that also has to do with equity and for the members and making sure that those people who haven't had any since 2017 are getting some. And so it's largely changing the timing and the distribution of who receives it rather than significantly increasing the COLAs that are expected.
What percentage of the recent retirees participated in the drop?
of the, so at the highest point, I would say at least 70% of members eligible, 70% of the active members were in fraud.
And again, not directly comparable, but they were getting, what, 6% interest on that up until the legislative change?
They were getting interest at various rates over time, yes.
Let me clarify something. It doesn't contradict it, but just to make it clear. So when we're providing the COLA in here, it is only to the pension benefit. The drop benefits are just being paid out as a flat amount each year. So we are not suggesting that COLA to the drop benefits.
And there is no drop in the Dallas ERF, right? So the ERS. Now, I just want to point out that if 70% of the retirees participated in this drop program, where they did get above market interest rates, perhaps the need is not as great as with the staff plan.
And that is something that I haven't really heard particularly with this system, but with other systems, I've heard vocalization by members that they kind of view the drop lump sum as their own sort of COLA to manage for a bit. It's not all of them, and it's definitely not explicitly a COLA. That is an element that those older retirees were in the more generous program that had those benefits.
You may look at like carving up the retiree population along either this basis or some other basis as you decide on a COLA.
So I would like, my answer wasn't very clear. The 70% related to how many actives were in fraud, right? 70% of the retirees were not in fraud. I don't have that number, but we had a plan before the old plan. Those people were never in fraud. So we have people with a lot of very small benefits. And then we have people that did have fraud that have larger benefits, and now we have new people that are really have.
Yeah. So you may, like I said, you may consider looking at different ways of cutting the retired population as you design the COLA.
Yeah, and we looked some at that, I would say, but it is difficult because some of the drop people took lump sums, and so we have no way to identify those people in the data or figure out how to cut that out. So
But you
it is
have that data.
It is complex, but
Yeah.
that is possible.
It is knowable information. The overarching point is we can ferret out based on when they retired, what benefits they received, and so on. So if the city wanted to provide the target code, it would effectively address those who are most behind.
Yeah.
Inflation. It's known information.
Yes, I mean, the data is available, it's not in our data. Yeah.
Did you all consider a fixed dollar employer contribution?
Briefly, but our objective was something that would adjust with actual experience. And so there have been proposals like for the grade up period to use fixed dollar amounts. Our concern with that is it doesn't take into account the experience that happens in the interim. And so you could end up with either a jump up or a jump down when you get to the end of that fixed dollar ramp. So our preference is to build the ramp into the actuarially determined contribution so that it adjusts each year and you don't end up with a substantial adjustment. You switch over.
But that's also why part of our recommendation is the split between the dollar amount on paying down the amounts related to prior service and then the percent salary for the ongoing service.
Thank you. Is that all the questions for now? Okay, who would like to speak next?
Hi, my name is Nick Merrick. I'm the current chairman of the board of trustees of the pension fund. I'm a Dallas-based businessman. I've been involved since the 2017, so part of the new reconstituted board. And I feel very comfortable representing to you that I think we have today a very, very competent, incredible organization. We've achieved a lot over these last 6 or 7 years. We've liquidated over $900 million of private assets. And way back when, we could have sold them all for $1 and got rid of the problem, but that would have dug a serious hole. Instead, we've methodically maximized the values while still generating liquidity. Evidence of that is that we run a negative cash shortfall in terms of money in versus money out. We have funded that well over 100% with cash realized from private investments. We've undergone this transition where we were lopsided. We were 60–70% private assets when we took over and only 10% public equities. We've really flipped that around today where we have approximately 2/3, 70% publicly traded assets, more like a traditional pension fund would have. We still are burdened with a few of those legacy private assets, and we're in the process of working through those. The way I've characterized it is that when we started getting involved, we were a vessel that was leaking oil, leaking fuel, rudder was broken, and didn't really know where it was going. Since that time, we've completely solidified the ship. We are very functional today. What we don't have is enough fuel to take us to our destination. We've always known that was going to be an issue, so we knew that this time period would arise, and we knew that we had to create competence in that time, not just the perception, but actual competence. Because before, the prior groups did not steward money well. And we know that a big part of this will be convincing all the stakeholders that we can be good stewards of capital. So our goal is to, first of all, comply with legislation in terms of coming up with a plan, and working with you and the other stakeholders, really de-risking the plan, and then moving the needle on trust with all the stakeholders, particularly people in the system and people who they're recruiting. So we really look forward to working with all of you, working with the city, Chiron, and available to help in any way possible.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick. Ms. Duffel, did you have some comments for us?
I did. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and staff. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I wanted to cover 2 topics just briefly this morning. And first, I mentioned before, I want to give you just a little insight into the 1/1/23 valuation. You haven't seen it yet, and just to remind you, we are held hostage every year by a material private equity fund that we have that reports to us late every year. And because it's material for our fund, we can't finish our audit. We actually are completing the 2022 audit, and the board will approve in February. We'll see the PRB, but you haven't seen the valuation. But to give you a little idea of the numbers. And the other thing is, I wanted just to talk a little bit about the section 2.025 that's in our statute, which came about through HB 31. So with that, on the valuation, we received it from the actuary in December, or passed it, and I was just going to highlight a couple of the numbers about it a little bit today. The actual numbers are that in the most recent valuation, the funding level is on market value of assets is 34.4%, so a little bit better than how much. That's down from 42% in the prior year. The actuarial accrued liability didn't change. It's $5.2 billion. What declined was our assets. We knew that was going to happen because our valuation was low too. As Mr. Hallmark mentioned, we had built in a minus 13% for 2022 when we had done that prior valuation. The numbers came in a little better than that, minus 11.46. So we ended a little bit better. Still down, but better than we anticipated being. With these new lower results, our funding period went from 68 years to fund to 82 years to fund, which is actually 2105. So it's like that type of election. The negative cash outflow that was discussed previously is a big problem for us. And in 2022, $110 million is the difference between the contributions. Basic high level on evaluation. Did you have questions on your original?
You said that your funding level was 34%.
Yes. I'm part of that. The next piece I wanted to discuss is just section 2.025, and that's the Dallas Police and Fire Pension Statutes. Many of you recall that in 2017, the process of getting HB 3158 passed was a very difficult process. It was a highly negotiated bill. We spent a lot of time on it. The PRB spent a tremendous amount of time on it. The city spent a lot of time on it. It was a lot of give and take in that process. One of the things that came out from that was a total change of the board. We used to have 8 police and fire members, 4 council members. So the members actually control the board. The change now is the mayor actually appoints the majority of the board. Nick is actually over. So that was one of the changes. The other change was adding the section 2.5 bill. And why that was important is we wanted to make sure that there was a mechanism to get in the contributions or make the plan changes that were necessary to ensure the short-term solvency, but also had a reasonable path for funding. Whole point of section 2.25. So as you know, and you can see here today, we are ahead of the schedule that is actually in the bill. The law requires that we appoint the actuary by July. We're way ahead of that the actuary's report comes out by November. The board makes a plan in December, and the PRB reports out in December. This is a huge issue. So that time frame of October, November, December is reasonable. So we went to the PRB, shape staff saying, yes, you can go early. So we started the process early. We faced with 2 pieces. We wanted to let the city know what the numbers were looking like as soon as possible. So we had Chiron do some preliminary work, which they reviewed this morning, so we could provide the city with some preliminary numbers. You know, you're not their own issue. And that's what we're doing. They expect, I think, they're coming to a February meeting with the report for the next part. So all of that has worked really well. Once we receive the report, the board will consider it as they're required to do in the statute. We are committed, the board is very committed, staff is committed to working with the city to try to come up with a solution that we call, that is the 100% goal. And we hope we'll get there. And the board will adopt a plan, the city will like the plan and agree with it. But if there is something that we don't agree on, whether it's a minor thing or a major thing, the board has a legal responsibility under section 2.05 to adopt a plan that meets the funding and standardization guidelines. And they must do that by November. And they will. They must, in according to the plan, consider the actuary recommendation. They will consider, although it's not written at all, statute, cities, fires. I'm convinced. I know our board will follow the guidelines and meet the requirements. So really, that's where we are, and we know that by November at the latest, actually still like this to be done by the summer, a plan will be in place that meets the funding requirements of section 2 or section 802. And because of that, we don't believe the FSR is required, because we will have met the requirements before the end of this year. And we really not negotiate.
May I?
Please,
Question?
Ms. White.
So why is it that a report that Chiron's preparing now cannot act as an FSRP and be approved by both the board and the city?
Well, the report they reviewed this morning, because it's not the motion, it's one just called for the statute. The next one, based on the 1/1/22 version, it could be, if the city agreed with it, the board agreed with it, it definitely could be what gets put into law. And that would be fine. But let's say there's one provision that the city doesn't agree with the board's position. The board still has the obligation to adopt the plan. That is in the law. They must. So if we can't get to an agreement, the board still needs to take action.
And I think the statutory change related to FSRPs was that the system has gone to the city with a request for a very large financial contribution. And it's incumbent upon city council specifically to approve that plan to ensure that the adequate funding is available and can be met by the city. And so I don't agree with the premise that because you have this separate obligation to prepare this report, that in some way the system is not subject to FSRP requirements.
I believe we are subject to FSRP requirements in the future. This is a time-limited part of the statute that expires 9/1 of 2025. And if you go back and you look at the two bills that were passed in 2017, the House passed one bill and the Senate passed another bill, and then of course they agreed. It's very clear, related to side by side what happened. The contributions in the House bill were much higher on the city side, and the control of the board was not given to the city in the House bill. And then it changed on the Senate. And what happened is the city contributions were lower at that time. They received the majority of the report and the section 2.5. And the reason that was the case is we were worried that the city wouldn't put in enough contributions when it came time to this time period. And this was the mechanism to that. Since then, the relationship is much better. The city, I think, is agreeable to the agency concept, which is huge. It's a huge page. But all of this is kind of really why we got there. We do want to come to agreement with the city and come, together and have everybody like the plan. What I'm just saying is if for some reason we can't get there, the board still is required to adopt something. But that's what the statute says.
I agree the board's required to adopt something, but I think the expectation is that what the board adopts is also acceptable to the city to the point in which the city council would also be in a position to adopt and sign off on this plan.
Well, that's definitely the goal.
Seems like the ideal scenario is for everybody to agree to a plan that obligates the effort. That's a short period, right? We can do this. Before we go on to the next folks, can you comment on Chiron's recommendations, their presentation, their proposals, concerns you have, things you like?
I think on that, our board hasn't taken any official position on that.
Yes, our process is such, we listen, so there's been a fair amount of input, but we've not had a lot of deliberation or output, so I share Kelly's thoughts, the whole idea of the ADC and that every year kind of carrying its own weight versus digging a hole, de-risking, creating more certainty in everyone's eyes. Those are, we call kind of first principles of this, and we think the ADC is a good way to get there. Perhaps monetizing city assets is another thing. So we look forward to discussing all those things, but I would be way premature to be voicing things like and dislike because the premise is that we've deliberated and to gain a consensus. We haven't done so.
You expect to work with your own actuary with regard to Chiron's recommendations? Will your actuary consider their recommendations?
Yes, we actually, in the February meeting, our actuary will be there. And they actually were in the meeting when we presented the first report.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the front folks? Thank you.
Actually, one more thing, please. Yeah, just that, because the lag of dates, and that now the majority of the assets are in publicly held securities. We had a very good 2023, so we were kind of talking about digging holes and fund ratios. So we produce good market returns, and all that will be calculated, and I'm sure that'll result in better core numbers. Still not at a level that's acceptable. But just want to let you know that because of the changes that we have made, we've actually seen differences in the growth in investment assets and being more consistent, and more like other public pension funds and having an asset base like that.
Are you working with an investment consultant?
Yes, we do, yeah.
Have they given you any information on what, expected returns on equity, public equity will be over like the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, yeah, and I think we use those as guideposts, but we don't. We have a hurdle rate of 6.5, which we have brought down. It was higher, several years ago. We think that's appropriate. We look at that relative to our own independent views of what a diversified portfolio should yield, along with comps from other comparable systems, and so we feel really good about that number. But yes, we looked at that.
All right, I only make the comment because I happened to attend a personal webinar put on by Vanguard. Made the comment that they expected public equity to return 5 to 6% over the next 10 years. So at 6.5%, there's still some, to me, there's still some risk. And again, that's why I would put the ASC.
That is the appropriate kind of risk. Before we had inappropriate risk, we had unsuitable assets.
Yeah.
That even if they performed, were not suitable for a public pension. Now we have the types of assets that are suitable, and the risks that we run really are risks you can't diversify.
Are you working with a workout firm on the remaining assets, or?
Yes, I mean, it really is more issue by issue. We have one in real estate that's helped us a lot, but it's a series of kind of one-offs. I mean, right now we're left with the toughest things left. And so each one is its own story. But yes, we've worked with third-party experts quite a bit.
Good.
But at the same time, our staff has built tremendous confidence in dealing with illiquid assets, which I think a lot of other pension funds, their investment staff would not have similar experience. Unfortunately, we got the wrong reasons, but we're very experienced.
Thank you. Let's move on to the city. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I am Jack Ireland. I serve as the Chief Financial Officer for the city. And today I would like to provide some remarks that we prepared on behalf of the city. First, thank you for allowing us to be here at the table with both Catalan and our pension fund representatives. The Dallas Police Department and the Dallas Snow Rescue Department are staffed by brave and dedicated men and women for whom we're grateful. And we do recognize that it's the city's responsibility to ensure that the pension benefits that they have earned are protected for their future. We're fully committed to ensuring their funding soundness of their funding. It is well known that prior to 2017 that the Dallas Police and Fire Pension System faced significant financial challenges. Enacting House Bill 3158 in 2017, the state legislature did make changes that stabilized the fund, including the changes to the governance, which has been mentioned, the increase of both the employee contribution and the city contributions. The city has continued to meet all funding requirements that were outlined in the legislature. House Bill 3158 did, as it's been already recognized that additional long-term solutions would be needed and that a new plan would be approved prior to 25. We do appreciate that the PRB took action to select Chiron as the actuary in the summer of 23, which was well in advance of the July 24 timeline. And we do appreciate that Dallas Police and Fire Pension was able to execute that contract. Similar to starting early, the city of Dallas has started as well. Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson established an ad hoc committee on pensions led by Mayor Pro Tem Janelle Atkins, who joins me here today, as well as 7 other city council members to study the issue, provide recommendations to the Dallas City Council. The ad hoc committee on pensions began their work in September and continue to meet monthly. Additionally, Mayor Johnson appointed a study group of financial experts, some of whom are former board members of the Dallas Police and Fire Pension. The study group was formed to provide analysis and recommendation to address the funding soundness. The study group did brief our ad hoc committee in both September and December of 2023. Furthermore, through monthly meetings led by our city manager, TC Barnex, we have solicited the input of representatives of 10 associations that represent the active police and fire personnel, and we're scheduled to begin similar conversations with the associations that represent retirees. The independent actuary selected by the PRB did provide their preliminary report to the ad hoc committee in November, and we do anticipate their final report on February the 8th. There are aspects of Chiron's preliminary report that the city strongly supports, such as the initial 5-year phase-in period that would allow the city to responsibly be able to manage the budget impact of the significant contribution increases that the city will face. And we do support the use of an actuarially determined contribution rate. However, there are aspects of Chiron's preliminary report that do increase retiree benefits and increase the liability through the accelerated cost of a living adjustments before the fund has reached 70% of funding status. City staff is focused on achieving the 30-year funding period before we consider increases to benefits. Considering Chiron's final report again that is due to us in February and other information that's being considered by the ad hoc committee on pensions, we're ready to continue working collaboratively with the staff and board of the Police and Fire Pension Fund on a mutually acceptable plan. It is our goal to reach an agreement on a plan that meets the 30-year funding requirement and satisfies both House Bill 3158 and satisfies a funding soundness restoration. The city's goal is to reach a mutually acceptable plan that can be approved by both the Dallas City Council and the board of the pension fund prior to July 24. This timeline will allow the city to incorporate the increased contributions that will be required of the city into our fiscal year 25 annual operating budget and begin making those increased contributions into the fund during fiscal year 25, which begins on October 1st. So in closing, the city of Dallas is committed to increasing our contributions. We're committed to ensuring the funding soundness of the Dallas Police and Fire system, and we're committed to ensuring and protecting the pension benefits for all police and fire employees and retirees. And again, thank you very much for allowing us to be here today as we show our support for the work that's being
Thank you, Mr. Island. We appreciate you all coming down, all of you for Dallas. Did I understand you to say that you support a effort to avoid going into FSRP?
We believe and agree that we should submit a 30-year funding plan that meets both the requirements of House Bill 3158 as well as the funding soundness restoration. We believe that both are applicable
And it sounds like you have a timeline for it sooner rather than later.
yes, sir. While it's not due to PRB FSRP until September 1st of 25, based on most recent communication, it is our plan and our goal to achieve that this year prior to November. Thank you.
And I can understand that, when you were just saying the only, and again, the recommendations are not final. These were preliminary recommendations, but currently your only issue is whether or not the COLA can be incorporated into the trust or. Yeah.
I believe that, thank you, ma'am. I believe that's the most significant difference. There are some other suggestions that we have that we would like to be considered. And so, but I just wanted to mention what our most significant concern is. There's definitely things that Chiron has presented that we do like. And we hope that we can work together with Chiron, the board, our council, and come to an agreement.
This city keeps its own actuary, is that right?
Yes, sir, we do.
And are you having them consider the Chiron recommendations?
Deloitte is the city's actuary, and they are involved in our review of the work that Chiron has done.
I sense a commitment to get a resolution on this in the next few months.
Absolutely. That is our goal.
May I ask you a question?
Please.
So I think earlier we had some discussion about the system, maybe, I'm not quite sure what the comment was, but about the city looking into monetizing some current assets of the system and able to meet some of these funding requirements. Can you just kind of walk us through what those discussions look like, both from a perspective of monetizing the assets, to bring down some of these funding commitments, but also any potential issues that funding those assets may have on future city budgets, because those revenues would not be coming into the city at that time.
Yes, ma'am. So we agree with the phase up, as I mentioned, the actuarially determined contribution rate. We are also looking at what opportunities we may have to monetize some city assets. And those assets and the monetization could be used for a cash infusion into the Dallas Police Department. If ever that were to happen, that would lower the ADC going forward and would lower the contributions going forward. We see that as an opportunity, but one that we have to think about very carefully before we go into monetizing the city asset. We do own a lot of properties. We discussed what is possible for selling, leasing, public-private partnership. However, we want a plan that will achieve full funding in 30 years, whether that happens or not. Monetizing an asset or cash infusion into a fund just benefits and helps the ADC and reduces future contributions.
So you would, sell or whatever, but it would be cash that would go into the fund. It wouldn't be a piece of property or anything like that.
That is the consideration at this point in time, but we are open to explore what other options are out there. But the conversation thus far, it came from the study group that was formed by the mayor, that they began to look at this as an opportunity. And so right now the consideration is cash.
Because again, what we wouldn't want to do is load up a pension fund with inflated real estate. Been there and done it.
But I do want to make sure it's understood that is a consideration that we want to explore. We have not identified a piece of property that we're moving on at this point in time. We've committed to the city council that over the next 12 months that we will identify the top 5 to 10 properties that we think may be an opportunity and begin that process. It is not something that would be part of a recommendation that came back this summer or before November. It would be something that would just help the plan down the road.
Mr. Atkins, you are a member of the city council pro tem, is that right?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And you oversee this, it's an ad hoc committee?
Yes, I'm the chair.
Okay. And is it your sense that the members of the ad hoc committee have a grasp of this situation and also are committed to getting a resolution for this sooner rather than later?
So, I believe that, what Ms. Adams said, and most like councilmen, we are fully, it's in this issue. We want to resolve this, get this behind us. We are strong financially, city of Dallas, but again, we got to be careful how we monetize it, how we accrue cash here. But we do think police, our uniform is first, the city need to be safe. But we gotta have a strong financial structure. But we are here to make sure the plan that we got present to you, we don't present to you early, not later. We're not looking at 2025, we're looking at sometime this summer, we should have a plan, we'll work through that plan constantly. We have some of our colleagues here, they are very concerned. We are dedicated to resolve this issue. We're not worried about what happened in the past, let's move forward, let's get this done. I think we can get it done, but we all gotta work together. It can't just be one side, it gotta be all three.
Thank you. It sure sounds like everybody has a common desire here. The pension review board stands ready to be of assistance to any of you. We would ask that you keep us apprised of how things are going. Are there any other questions for anybody here on the panel? Thank you all very much for coming up. We appreciate your time to share your questions. Next item is an update from the Austin Firefighters Retirement Fund on potential plan changes. And I will now call on Anamaya Kumar, Executive Director of Austin Firefighters Retirement Fund. I do my remarks on this item. Anu, welcome back. It's good to see you.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members. It's a bittersweet moment to be here on the other end of the fence. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present to you today. I know you all have a full agenda, so my presentation brief, I have good things to report, but then also acknowledge some things that have been highlighted more in the recent past for us. And let me begin by saying I've been with the Austin and I'm Anvena Kumar, Executive Director of Austin Firefighters Retirement Fund. I've been with the system for 2 years now. And it's been a really good experience working with an organization and working with a board that we have now that's committed to ensuring the funding health of our plan, as well as ensuring that our members' promised benefits are paid. And I have put together a brief presentation for you. I don't plan to walk through every slide. I understand you all are aware of the funding situation of Austin Fire. As of 2022, we hired a new actuary and Chiron, and we partly made sure one of the key duties that a pension board has is to ensure the consultants, more specifically fund actuary, is evaluated on a periodic basis. So the board started with our actuary and made a change. When you compare our 2022 valuation, which was performed by Chiron versus the 2021 valuation, of course, with the market downturn, we did get impacted with an investment return of a negative 10%. So that played into our amortization period that has increased from over 17 years to now over 35 years. Our funded ratio has declined, as you can see in the fund statistics slide, from upwards of 90% to now around 87%. And this is on an actuarial basis. On a market value basis, it's lower than 86, it's around 80%. However, with this funded ratio, given where we were at prior to 2022, we feel confident that we are still in a pretty strong funding position to where we, of course, received the at-risk funding soundness restoration plan letter from the pension review board, which essentially means we haven't triggered the funding soundness restoration plan requirement. However, we are projected to trigger that requirement 2 years by 2025. And that was, of course, confirmed by our actuary. We did some projections to look at where we are headed. With the culture that the Austin Fire Board has, the board decided to be proactive about that, not take a wait and watch approach to trigger the requirement and then make any changes, but rather to step up, acknowledge that things might not look as good down the line and we should take some action. And let me step back. Part of the reason why, of course, the 2022 valuations came back with a higher amortization period is in addition to a bad financial market that was experienced across systems. The fund, the board also made some actuarial assumption and method changes in line with the recommendations, initial recommendations that we received from our new actuary, Chiron. And Chiron is also currently performing an experience study, so the board would again be evaluating to make sure we are on a sound track, including as far as our actuarial assumptions go, as far as costing our plan is done in a sound and reasonable manner moving forward. But there were some tightening of assumptions that were done as part of the 2022 valuation, is part of the reason why our amortization went up as well. And over time, I believe since 2016, the fund has also been lowering its return assumption. So currently we are at 7.3%. With our return assumption, again, that's something the board would be reevaluating based on the upcoming experience study that we have. On the investment program side, I also wanted to quickly mention the board, again, being proactive and making sure that they are being good stewards of the fund like they have been in the past, hired an outside independent investment firm, Talent, to perform the investment performance evaluation as part of a requirement that the PRB has. So we are also in the midst of performing that evaluation to ensure not only are we looking at the funding side, but then we are also looking at the benefit side as part of the at-risk FSRP status, as well as the investment side. So we have all our bases covered as we go through and engage in this process of FSRP. I've also included some historical data for y'all from a funded ratio standpoint, where since 2013 is how far back we go in the information we provided to you, but of course I'll have additional information on the PRB database. The funded ratio, of course, has been on a really good track, of course, following the 2021 event. The amortization period for Austin Fire since 2013 has been within the preferred range that the PRB has, within the 10 to 25 year preferred range that y'all have is what we have been striving for. But then again, with the 2022 numbers, we are over the 30-year max. Member contributions, the Austin firefighters retirement fund members do not participate in Social Security. Their contribution rate is more on the higher side. It's 18.7%, and the city puts in 22%. And in the past, in addition to the board, the membership also has a history of stepping up and making contribution increases if it has been required back in early 2010, 2012. The COLAs, the fund was providing COLA based on a policy that the board had adopted, but there was a very long time period, over a decade, when the fund did not grant COLA. And then for the past 2 years, in line with the COLA policy that the board had adopted, the fund has not been granted cost of living adjustments. We have also included a projection graph from our Actuarial, which is essentially a stress testing that they did for us to show with our funded ratio as well as with our amortization period where we are headed based on the assumptions and the contribution rates as it stands today, which shows by 2025 our amortization period is projected to go up significantly to infinite. Now, that's essentially a brief snapshot of where we stand today, as well as how did we get here. What this means for us as the Pension Review Board has highlighted is we are on the FSRP at-risk list, which means we haven't triggered it, but we could potentially trigger it by 2025. The AFRF board created a working group to develop a voluntary FSRP and start engaging with our membership as well as engaging with the city of Austin, which is of course a key stakeholder in this entire process. So we don't kick the can down the road and we take ownership of what needs to happen now rather than 2-3 years down. That's where we are at with the working group in conjunction with our new actuary Chiron has started engaging in looking at options as well as discussing with the city what goals that the city has. Of course, the city has already worked on entry reforms for the 2 sister funds that we have here in Austin. And so we are being mindful of what from a contribution standpoint, funding standpoint, the changes that the city has worked on. with those two systems. It's something we will be keeping in mind. And then our goal essentially is to develop a voluntary SRP, and the potential and go through the legislative process from 2025 to memorialize the changes that hopefully are shared as well as agreed upon and memorialized in state level. That concludes my remarks. And you answer any questions?
Two more questions.
Yes.
for her.
And can you remind me what the total normal cost percentage is for the plan?
As of the 2022 valuation, it's little over 30%.
And so, the reason I bring that up is I remember reading in the Statesman, along maybe 6 months ago about, somebody who transferred from the Colleen Fire Department, took a job, was getting better pay, thought he was getting better pay, until he realized he had to pay 18% pension plan. So I guess my other question would be is, what is the status? Is the city able to hire the firefighters, that, in order to meet your growth assumptions? Chuck?
So yes, we do have new cadets coming into the fund, which is of course great. However, the high contribution rate is certainly a concern that we hear from our members. However, we have a pretty low termination rate as well. So given the current benefits that are offered to our members, that's something I suppose helps incentivize those firefighters to at least continue in the fund, but we certainly hear concerns about especially new firefighters having to put in the 18.7% contribution.
But again, in this situation where the normal cost is 30%, they are getting a substantial employer provided benefit. So,
Yes, they are, however, sharing a significant bit of the normal cost burden, as I understand. You're right, the city has in the past as well, alongside the members, increased the city contribution rates as well, and we hope for a similar partnership in the future. And so far, we've been in good conversations. Open to working with us.
What changes to the system will make on its own? What are your
The fund or the members can increase the member contribution with a member vote. So that's something with the employee contribution increase, which has happened in the past, the board can engage with the membership and make that proposal. As far as benefits go, with the draw program that we have, the board has the option to change the drop interest rate for future members, for members who haven't started participating in the drop program. So that's certainly an option the fund has, or the board has, to make changes to the drop interest rate. Aside from those, from a benefit standpoint, the board does not have much say to make any plans.
So considering the employee contribution rate is 18+%, it sounds as if you may be approaching the legislature.
That's right. On the of course, this is something that we haven't talked specifics with the city, but even on the cost of living adjustment side, again, this group does not participate in Social Security, and some of the concerns that have been raised with our COLA policy, the board wants to make sure we are being, again, the board is being a responsible steward of the fund and has a more holistic discussion about offering a benefit package to our membership that accounts for, of course, given we have a high contribution rate, but then also for our retiree benefits, that there is some purchasing power protection down the line. And that is being funded appropriately.
Thank you. Questions for the We appreciate you coming and proactively sharing this with us. Please let us know how you can help. Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break? Time Act governance projects. I would like to ask Ms. Mariah Miller to present on items 7, 8. Welcome, Ms. Miller.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. My name is Mariah Miller, and I'm the policy and communication manager for the PRB. We are currently undergoing a review of the Texas Local Firefighters Department Act, FLFRA, and their governance structures. Through this presentation, I'm going to provide some background information concerning both governance and FLFRA, review the previous work and research that has already gone into the creation of this project, go through some potential governance issues that staff have identified, and then finally, we'll discuss the feedback timeline for both board and stakeholder input leading up to our final parts. When considering governance, there can sometimes be a few different definitions and considerations. However, for our purposes, we're specifically looking at the systems and processes that comprise the oversight and control of the organization. So more or less how systems make decisions and they structure their operations. Generally, we recommend that processes should be consistent and well documented in compliance with statute and best practices and transparent. We are wanting to focus on governance specifically because it's involved with so many aspects of pension fund management. For example, good governance helps ensure that trustees understand what their board is and is not able to do, identify potential strategies, and make sure that they are aware of best practices. It creates accountability for those trustees and delineates what responsibilities are pertinent to each of the fiduciaries. It also helps build stakeholder confidence in their funds, knowing that their system is well managed. It helps reduce the risk of fiduciary breaches, litigation, and other associated risks that come along with the daily operations of the system. And it may also improve long-term investment returns.
I think we were on the next slide. Is that what, that's the slide you just presented, right?
That is the slide, yeah. Next. Thank you. Article 6243E of the Vernon Civil Statutes is known as the Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act. Originally, this was created as the Fireman's Relief and Retirement Act back in 1937, and it was restated in 1989 in Vernon. Helper systems have some aspects that are mandated in statute, such as their board composition. Each system has to have 7 board members. But they also have a minimum sponsor contribution in statute, and that is the lesser of 12% for the matching of the member rate. However, outside of certain mandatory provisions, other aspects such as daily operations is controlled locally. One feature of helper systems is that they undergo a membership vote for changing either their benefits or their member contributions. Any provisions that are brought up to a member vote must first be approved by the system actuary and then subject to that membership vote. Historically, healthcare systems have underperformed, and that's considering them overall as a group. However, there have been some recent improvements. According to the most recent actuarial evaluation that was presented at the last board meeting, we saw that out of the 42 healthcare systems, there are now only 6 with a discount rate above 7.5%. The median funded period also dropped below 30 years, and there are now only 6 systems with a funding period above 50. There's also a slight increase in the median funded ratio, which is now 64%. So this is compared to June 2022, where there were 8 systems with a discount rate of 7.5%. The median amortization period was 34 years, and there was 12 systems with the funding period of 50. And the funded ratio, as I mentioned, had a slight increase, and so that was now at 64, it was previously at 69%. Many healthcare systems haven't had a lot of sponsor engagement in the past. System and sponsor communication just wasn't always as frequent or as thorough as it would have been to be beneficial to both sides. However, in recent years, that communication and collaboration has generally been increased. This is due to a variety of reasons. For example, one reason is that GASB number 68 requires that cities report their pension obligations on their financial statements. So with cities being concerned with the potential impact that pensions will have on their bond ratings, there's been some more engagement on the sponsor side. The pension review board's also been undertaking intensive reviews over the past several years, and those intensive reviews help foster system and sponsor relationships. Of the 12 intensive reviews we have done to date, a lot have been with the systems. Another requirement that has helped increase communication between the two parties is the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan, or FSRP, which those began back in 2015, and in 2021, the legislature passed some more stringent requirements about what would trigger an FSRP. Those new requirements are in place next year. So a little bit more information on the FSRPs. Those are jointly developed between the system and the sponsor to help improve the funding status of financially distressed systems. Right now, we have 3 telco systems that have legacy FSRPs, 5 telco systems that are currently subjected to an FSRP or that are at risk of an FSRP, and 6 who have fully completed their FSRP. So this governance project is several years in the making. As you may remember, back in 2020, the board directed staff to study retirement system governance. At that time, we looked specifically into contribution and benefit decisions, as well as board member qualifications. Both of those documents are included in your committee packet. Then in 2022, the House Pensions, Investments, and Financial Services Committee, or HIPS, had an interim charge specifically to review telco governance. The PRB testified before the committee on August 16, 2022, and there was an interim report released with 5 recommendations back in January 2020. None of those recommendations became bills that were followed them. In spring 2023, graduate students from the LBJ School of Public Affairs completed a policy research project, focusing specifically on telco governance, which we will touch on a little bit more in a moment. And then the board directed staff to study telco governance as well back in 2023. In the fall of 2022, the agency engaged a team of graduate students to conduct a project investigating telco governance issues and develop recommendations. The student analysis found that governance variables, including compliance with MET requirements, were associated with overall better outcomes for telco systems. The student report ended with several recommendations. And the recommendations included things such as using agreements between systems and sponsors, such as memorandums of understandings or collective bargaining agreements. They also recommended reforming the citizen seat structure on telco boards, which, as a reminder, is one of the statutory provisions for telco systems. They also recommended that telco systems increase the utilization of websites to help broadly spread information. And they also recommended implementing the use of an actuarially determined contribution. The student report served as a foundation for more research for the PRB. Staff reviewed the findings from the student report that helped create a pathway for us to continue looking into what areas we want to further refine or provide some recommendations ourselves. We took the report into consideration while we were progressing with the project, and you can find a copy of the student report in your packets as well. The agency also utilized a stakeholder work group. The work group allowed us to speak with a few representatives from systems and sponsors to really see how various governance issues were impacting them and help narrow down what topic areas we really wanted to focus in on and where further refinement or clarifications were needed. The work group membership included representatives from Corpus Christi Fire, Longview Fire and City, Beaumont Fire, Midland Fire and City, Lufkin Fire, Odessa Fire and City, and Irving Fire. In total, we had 3 meetings, and those meetings covered internal governance issues, system and sponsor relations, and then also the relationship between the systems and the PRB. These discussions were extremely beneficial to the agency and really helped us focus in on key areas where potential legislative recommendations may be helpful, or other areas of assistance, where assistance to systems may be needed. Whether that be either in form of having additional training courses or issuing guidance. So before we move into looking into what governance issues staff has specifically identified and what our resulting recommendations are, I first just want to state that the document and the presentation is reflective of staff analysis. It's a synthesis of information from various sources. It is a staff-produced document, and the material presented for today is not intended to be a reflection of the beliefs of any members of the work group or that of any members of the LBJ student group. This is intended to be a concrete starting point for further stakeholder and board feedback, and we anticipate finalizing the recommendations for possible board approval later this year. Broadly, staff has identified 4 topic areas. Topic area 1 is system funding and decision-making practices. Area 2 is board structure and membership. Area 3 is transparency and communication. And topic area 4 is additional areas for research and consideration. Looking specifically at system funding and decision-making practices, you notice that there were certain guidelines and requirements set in statute for teller systems. However, as I previously noted, general operations and administrative practices are left up to the systems board to determine what would work best for them. Sponsors are not required to be involved with setting the benefits. And that is something, as I mentioned before, set to the member vote, but those any changes do first have to be approved by the action. We have heard feedback that sponsors are occasionally hesitant to raise their contributions because they're concerned that as a result, systems are going to raise their benefit levels. There are already some systems and sponsors who are working together to create joint working agreements though that help set expectations for both parties. So the main issue we've identified here is that the statutory decision-making processes may occasionally hinder progress, resulting in more funding issues faced by health systems and their sponsors. To address these issues, staff has come up with a few potential options, some of which would require statutory changes and therefore need to be a legislative recommendation. One potential statute change the board can consider recommending is that the sponsoring entity must first approve benefit or contribution ballot options before this goes to a member vote. This would still be in addition to the actuary approval, which is, as I mentioned, part of that process. And this could also be another area where the PRB may want to issue some guidance, and that guidance could contain information on how to effectively conduct a member vote, utilizing feedback that we received from the work group. So, for example, the work group did note that proactive member education really assisted them with conducting successful member votes. And so the guidance may include more information on best practices in that area. It also include information on the creation of joint working between sponsors and the system. This is an area where funding policies could also be helpful in the creation and formalization of such. Additionally, the PRB may also create a continuing education course that has information about successful system reforms.
Ms. Miller,
Yes,
I
sir.
asked stop you for a moment, please.
Yes, sir.
Back to the one on statutory legislative required sponsoring to first approve ballot options. Can you clarify what that means?
So we have, yes. So having an agreement in place where the sponsoring entity would approve what goes on that ballot before the members do. So let's say there is a vote that they're looking at potentially increasing the benefit allowance or having a COLA. Before that can even go to the members, the sponsoring entity would have to first sign off saying, yes, we agree with this, and you can move forward. It then allows both sides to kind of have some input and a stake in that decision-making process instead of being a little bit more one-sided.
So that would be potentially take the form of a recommendation to PRB to make a statutory change.
Yes, sir, it could. So that could be something that we want to do a legislative recommendation for. Alternatively, we could just put out some best practices or guidance that suggests that this becomes a process that systems and their sponsors undertake through either a separate agreement themselves, but for this to be widespread, that actual requirement would to go through a statutory change.
Because right now, Telfer members can increase their benefits with a vote
Yes.
without any consent from the sponsor.
Yes.
That's a follow-up question.
Say again,
I said, may I ask a follow-up?
please.
Um. Understanding the benefits associated with requiring the sponsoring entity to first approve it before it goes to the members. I guess I'm just wondering if it wouldn't be kind of better to take a more holistic view towards it. And that, you know, I think some of the recent initiatives that some of our plans have, where they have these agreements that kind of set the corridors. Right, if there is gonna be a statutory change, why limit it to a ballot or proposed benefit change? Why not kind of maybe put Telpro systems on the same path forward that some of these other pension funds are, so that they can work or devise their own corridor systems for funding, so that if either things don't perform the way they think they will perform, or if there's some change, you have something built in as checks and balances, so that you don't have both the system and the sponsor agreeing, so maybe an unsustainable benefit change.
Okay, one,
Yeah, I would just say that we're kind of considering the need to balance the fact that you have one statute that governs 42 plans. And so the guidance and technical assistance recommendation about encouraging individual systems and sponsors to work out those agreements. It could be both, like we really have to, the board wouldn't necessarily pick. But one of them is about kind of taking all those examples that we have of software systems that have worked with sponsors on agreements like that, and making those available to all software systems and potentially learning from that and issuing guidance. But we did come up with a potential statutory change just because it seemed like we could present some different options and we could see what stakeholders.
it's worth pointing out that it's extraordinary, very unusual to have plan participants selecting their own benefits. It almost never happens. And the reason it doesn't happen is because when you raise benefits for yourself, it's essentially increasing the liability on taxpayers. And normally the standard way things happen in this country is that taxpayers have some say in what their obligations are. And in this case, it's basically an increase in the taxpayer obligation. The taxpayers do not have a say so. Thank you. Ms. Josh.
But again, these plans are still subject to the law requiring the joint development of funding policy. So there should be more contact in monitoring, developing the funding policy than perhaps there has been in the past. I agree with Kate's comment.
Yeah, and I also wanted to clarify, that was something we mentioned in the working document too, is that the funding policy requirement, because it's a joint requirement now, that can be a foundation that the systems can use to work on agreements like that with their sponsors that put what we talked about in the work group was guardrails around when benefit increases could be considered.
Thank you. Please.
All right, moving on to board structure and membership. So as a reminder, the developer board structure is set in statute. It's a 7-member board. There are 3 members that are representatives from the retirement system. There are 2 citizens who are neither active members of the system nor they sponsor employees. Then there is the mayor or the mayor's representative. And then finally, there is a CFO, or in cases where there is not a CFO, it's the employee responsible for finance for the sponsor. An issue raised during the work group meetings was that there are currently no guidelines or guidance on addressing how systems should handle inactive board members or trustees who are non-compliant with NEC requirements. Some systems, though, have already started taking measures themselves, including the creation of attendance policies and education policies. Another issue that was raised was that some helper systems are having issues identifying and finding qualified citizen seat board members to fill those positions.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
who selects the 2 citizens who are not members of the system?
Who selects them?
Yeah, they elected.
They are elected, I believe, by the board, and each system, when they're in work group meetings, each system kind of has their own way of identifying who the potential candidates are, which is actually something that we were considering issuing some guidance on to help them identify who could be a good fit for that seat, but right now it's not for election.
I would like to make a comment on
Please.
this. You know, it is my impression since I've joined this board that the helper systems, some are small, some are big, some are subject to filing the investment return reports, detailed investment studies, some are not. And my concern is that there are boards operating out there that do not have the wherewithal to make pension fund investment decisions. And I guess one of the things that struck me from reading the supporting research is what I would like to see in our recommendations is something about requiring investment knowledge among board trustees, whether it's the designation of you can't, if somebody's a chief financial officer or a finance officer for a community, doesn't necessarily mean they have pension fund investment knowledge. And I think that needs to be a requirement in the membership of a pension board. If they are going to manage money, you know, not only taxpayer money, but money that's taken out of people's paychecks. So I guess I would like to see some recommendation with regard to board structure on that. And if a plan isn't able to find, and I realize that they struggle to find board members, then we've got to start looking at, you know, separate accounts in a pooled structure where you can afford to hire professional investment managers. And again, I don't know what the investment committee has thought about this, but you know, in the intensive reviews that I've looked at, a lot of it is a result of poor investment decisions. And yes, things are improving. Everybody's trying to hire a consultant, but I still think there needs to be something about who's on the board.
And that was actually something that was identified in Mercury. We did ask them to get an idea of what they were considering to get qualifications, investment background, and industry knowledge. So that is definitely something we can further consider refining when we issue guidance.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that, yeah, that some of the boards are actively doing that. That's something that they actively are looking for. And we noticed that the work group members were then asking each other questions about how they go about doing that. So it ended up being an information sharing mechanism for them as well. So
I want to talk for a moment about the two citizens who are not members of the system sponsored employees. First, I have a question. Citizens of what?
So I believe it's citizens of the jurisdiction, is that correct? Or the state?
I think it used to be the jurisdiction, but I think they changed it, so it's statewide.
So I remember that was one of the things that come up, was the statewide versus.
So if citizens of the state of Texas can serve on a Telfer board, you can be from anywhere and serve on a local Telfer board. So you're not necessarily serving the community that you live in, right?
Yes, I suppose that could occur.
I've heard cases where it does occur. If I was on a governing body, and I've been on governing bodies before, I was given the opportunity to choose fellow members of that governing body. I'm going to look for members of the governing body who agree with me. Did that come up in the conversation?
That specifically did not come up. However, that could be something we elaborate on, discuss further when we're issuing. And if we do decide to move forward with the recommendation to issue guidance, that's something we definitely discuss.
It's self-selection, it's reinforcement. And depending on who, whether or not there are vacant positions on here, on the board, well, I just think there's the opportunity to be very self-selective on the board. An overarching responsibility of any board, in my view, is to challenge methods and assumptions. And when everybody's getting along and sees the world the same way, then we're not getting challenging methods and assumptions.
And hasn't it been the case that a lot of times citizens are former members? You know, the prohibition is they're not active members, but they could be retired members.
Yes, ma'am, and that's actually one of the, like recommendations that we were gonna bring up. That's have to do with that balance representation between the systemic sponsor, because there is the potential, for that representation to tip pretty heavily in favor of the system, and so that is something that we were, specifically wanting to address, at least issue some potential options of how we want to move forward, but, proposing some solutions for that.
Please.
That actually is perfect segue to where I was about to go, which is one of the main issues I identified in this area was that the board structure may need some updates to address concern about that balanced representation. And another issue that we identified was that some systems are struggling with that, having either disengaged or non-compliant trustees. And their systems and their administrators just do not have the tools or policies in place to fully address the situation. So staff has identified the following potential recommendations to start addressing these issues. First and foremost, potential area where the board may want to issue a legislative recommendation is considering a statutory change to the Telfer board structure. One potential option we considered is recommending that one of those citizen seat positions becomes an additional sponsor appointee position and still retaining that other citizen seat, but one of them would become an additional sponsor. So we are still in the process of considering what the specific recommendations would be here, and this is something where we are open to committee, board, and stakeholder feedback as we further develop this. Another potential legislative recommendation would be to provide statutory authorization for the Telfer boards to remove disengaged or non-compliant board members. So this may look like authorizations for the board to adopt a policy that would remove those members, adding language to the statute that would allow for any appointed trustees to be removed by the mayor, or any elected trustees to be removed by members in accordance with a policy adopted by the board. And then we could also potentially look into formalizing a statute that any absences beyond a specific percentage or a number of meetings could be cause for dismissal.
Please.
Does that need statutory authorization?
So the statutory authorization would more or less help the system to know that that is an option. They are able to adopt those policies currently, right now, and there are a couple of participants in our work group who actually had attendance policies or education policies that were kind of to that degree. But sort of what helped us come up with this potential recommendation. But yeah, it doesn't need statute to occur, but the authorization would help make them aware that that is an option there for them.
Right, I think some of the feedback from the work group was that they felt like they would be on more solid ground to do those things if there was a specific statutory authorization, because the statute currently is silent on that. And we also found examples from other systems that Mariah can elaborate on, if you like, that where they have specific mechanisms in their statute about how board members could be removed. And it varies a little bit from system to system. But we did use that. We did use those. That's where the examples came from, was looking at other, especially what they have.
But I guess what's envisioned is just a statutory authorization that it's permissible to remove, but not providing the specific criteria for removal. Is that correct?
We haven't gone any further in developing what the specific recommendation would be. So the actual language, something that as we progress further, is something that we could definitely work on either incorporating that or not incorporating that. But
Yeah, my preference would be not.
What do you mean?
To not get into that kind of granular level of detail within the statute, but for criteria for removal, just provide that it's permissible. Because if you provide that level of specificity and something arises that's not addressed by statutes, then you're precluding removal.
Okay, but the problem with that is that what if you've got a board member who's consistently disagreeing with the rest of the board, says, we want that person out. And there's no solid criteria for removing somebody, then anybody is prone to be dumped based on a majority vote of the board. Right? I mean, that's what we're looking at. We're saying, we're going to get rid of that guy who keeps bringing up these inconvenient facts, which is exactly what we don't want.
But wait a minute, isn't, again, if you have a legislative change, but right now, the members can vote out their representatives. And the city, the mayor can remove their members, but it's not the board who removes a member, right?
That sounds right, but we're talking here about establishing a process by which boards could remove some of their own. And I think it's very dangerous. We don't like these people on the board who don't agree with us. Vote them off the island.
If I may, for a moment, one of the specific things that was kind of identified was that this was intended to be geared towards members who are non-compliant with their MET requirements, so already not sufficiently completing requirements that they, as a board member, are expected to be completing, or members who are absent from meetings for a very specific number of those meetings. And I don't remember them off the top of my head from the example policies. I think they were pretty substantially high. So at least I think in those two specific examples we were looking at, they are very much so like objective metrics versus like a subjective, I don't like this person or I disagree with this person. It's more of
That's legitimate. If somebody's consistently not showing up or if they haven't done the net, and that's reason. Other comments, questions on this?
Well, I mean, I think maybe to address your concern, right, if we provided if there was a statutory change for board removal, maybe if it was a supermajority voting for, you could prevent some of the abuses that
Yes,
you
we got one, okay, we got one guy who's consistently disagreeing with everybody. Let's get rid of it. 6-1. What if he's right?
Well, I guess following up on your comments, I would say the statutory requirement doesn't have to be granular, but maybe says that the only reason a board could remove somebody is because of attendance policies or MET compliance. And each fund probably would set its own. Each fund should be required to set an attendance policy and comply with MET. So the board would have very limited responsibility for limited reasons. So to avoid Keith's concern. But I don't think you would need to specify in this 3 meetings, you're out. And in the legislature.
For what it's worth, when I served on, I think it was the Georgetown City Council, you had certain meetings, it was 40%. All right, thank you. Please.
the next slide, please. Outside of statutory or legislative recommendations, we've also identified a couple of areas where staff needs further guidance or technical assistance would be helpful. For example, the PRB could potentially just issue guidance helping systems identify what qualified members for the agency positions would look like. And also additionally, we could look into issuing guidance discussing standards of engagement.
And sorry, by my energy. Just kind of building on what Mariah said. When we did these worker meetings, we did discover that systems had implemented some processes like the education policies, the attendance policies. So part of that would be, collecting those examples and making them applicable systems. Kind of a sort of technical assistance.
Moving on to transparency and communication. Historically, we've noticed that systems have been struggling to maintain good ongoing communication with their sponsors. However, high-performing systems tend to have really good communication practices, and this was something that was noted in the LDJ student report. However, both staff and also the LDJ student report did notice that not all systems have all of their reports and other statutory required documentation easily accessible on a public website. So as a reminder, there is a statutory requirement that certain reports are submitted to the PRB are made publicly available online. So the main issue that we identified here is that information may not be easily accessible by all parties, including the sponsoring entity and membership, and that stakeholders are not able to easily retrieve and review certain documents pertaining to systems, operations, or their funding. Another issue is that minutes and board meeting materials are not always very comprehensive, or they are incomplete. Similarly, we are just sometimes not able to identify them or locate them online at all. And then finally, systems are having difficulty contacting and maintaining communication with their sponsoring entity to discuss plan issues, which is imperative for the systems.
But each board has a mayoral representative, right?
Yes.
So I find it hard that somebody's having a hard time contacting the sponsor, the mayor, or the designated.
And the CFO.
Just to add to that, I think what we learned from the work group discussions is that the system's ability to communicate with the sponsor largely depends on the level of engagement of those particular board members. And that can vary.
So a potential legislative recommendation would be to require the sponsoring entity of the telephone system to make publicly available on their website any reports that the system submits to the PRB. This would help already satisfy that already existing statutory requirement for those documents to be publicly available, while helping increase collaboration and communication between those two parties. It would help kind of bridge that resource gap that may occur for especially some of the smaller telephone systems who just do not have the resources to contract out a website administrator and don't have the staff knowledge to do that themselves. Furthermore, the PRB may issue some guidance or create a continuing education course that further discusses transparency and communication.
Is it envisioned that the guidance and technical assistance would deal with the issue of the minutes and board meeting materials?
Yes,
Incomplete or
that is definitely something we could include in that, either guidance or the continuing education.
We have found that the quality of these people is very consistent, so we have really good examples that. Oh, this.
yeah, I mean, I think that that's a huge issue, right? I mean, we've experienced that firsthand, and I think some level of just appropriate governance is having the ability to look back to see what has been done.
Okay, so finally, a couple of areas that we identified that need some additional research or consideration. It was brought up during the telephone workers meetings that some of the statute language just may need some revision. So as I stated up front, that original statute for telephone was created in the 1930s. And there are several references in there to volunteer systems for systems that don't have volunteers anymore, or there's just some other technical language that no longer applies to how systems are established and functioning today. It was also brought up during work group meetings that's sometimes difficult for new or incoming trustees and administrators to fully understand all the purity requirements necessary reports. It's also been noted that telco systems generally just have few staff and resources, so they may benefit from having access to more reference material overall. The main issue we identified under this topic is that the statutory language is potentially outdated and may not reflect current practices. And some additional information sharing mechanisms may be beneficial for health systems. So a potential statutory update we may recommend could be updating the Helper statute language just for technical and clarifying changes. When developing those very specific recommendations, we would want to make sure that we are reaching out and collaborating with the stakeholders of this to thoroughly identify what areas need to have any of those tweaks and corrections. Additionally, the PRB could create either a new core or CE course that goes through the reporting requirements and the role of the PRB, which would be intended for new administrators and trustees. As a side note there, the agency does kind of review this on an informal basis. When requested, we are more than happy to give kind of a orientation to any new trustees or administrators to go through information about like MBT requirements and your reporting requirements. But this would be formalizing that and making it readily available online like the rest of the courses. The PRB may also implement a process to collect, share, and then regularly update example policies, such as requests for proposals or other relevant resources. We could then make this available to helper systems so they can utilize it as needed. And that way nobody is really having to like reinvent the wheel, so to speak. They can look and see what other similar systems have been doing and use that material as a starting point or jumping off point for creating their own. This is something Amy had mentioned with relation to some of the other policies, and this kind of fits in that same category. It's making more material available so that they can communicate amongst themselves and really work together to have good policies and procedures in place. So this project is still underway. Everything that was laid out today is our preliminary recommendations. As we noted, there are several potential pathways that we may want to continue down, whether it be through legislative recommendations, guidance, or MET courses. We want to ensure that you as the committee have the ability to provide as much input as you'd like, as well as any other stakeholders having the ability to continue to provide their input. So next month, we will have these preliminary recommendations available for stakeholder feedback. In March, we have another board meeting. So we will be providing an update to the board at that time on this project. In May, that's our next actuarial committee meeting. And during that time, we will present updated material and any stakeholder comments we received. Then in July, we will have the updated recommendations incorporating the committee feedback ready for the board meeting. And then September is when we are aiming to have those final recommendations presented to the board for possible approval. If those are approved, those recommendations will make their way into the PRB biannual report in November, which is the report that we deliver to the legislature. And that concludes my presentation on corporate governance projects. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much. Other comments or questions from Ms. Miller? All very interesting. We appreciate all the work staff. Thank you. And I think you're going to stay there, and Mr. Fee is going to join you for item 8. Review of the PRB pension funding guidelines and guidance for funding policy. Welcome, Mr. Fee. Thank you.
All right, so another project the PRB is currently undertaking is the review of the pension funding guidelines and guidance for developing a funding policy. The Pension Review Board's pension funding guidelines provides guidance to public retirement systems and their sponsoring governmental entities for meeting their long-term pension obligations. The guidelines are intended to foster communication between systems and their sponsors as they determine a reasonable approach to responsible funding, whether their contribution rate is fixed or an ADC. Originally created back in 1984, the guidelines have been revised 4 times. Once in 1996, again in 2011, and then most recently, they were revised in 2017. So at the time of the most recent revision, the systems that had a funding period between 30 and 40 years were given until June 2025 to reach a 30-year funding period. During the 86th legislative session, this was formalized and extended to September Under section 802-2011 of the Texas Government Code, Texas public retirement systems and their sponsors are required to jointly develop and adopt a fund policy. When the statute was first created, the agency developed guidance and an example policy to assist systems with the formation of their end funding policy. Since then, 96 systems have adopted and submitted a policy. Since it has been several years since either document was last revised, there have been some changes to statute requirements and best practices that we want to ensure were reflected in our resources. For example, we've updated the documents to reflect that funding policies are now a statutory requirement, one where systems and sponsors must collaborate, and that the FSRP mechanisms have changed. We also wanted to ensure that we are in accordance with the best practices established by GFOA, ASOP, GASB, and other national benchmarks. In addition to major changes from best practices and legislation, we've also made some technical updates to the language just to ensure that the formatting was consistent with other New York jurisdictions. In your board meeting packets or committee meeting packets, we've included both a clean copy of the updated guidelines and guidance, as well as a red line version so that you can see exactly what changes have been announced. So first, focusing on the pension funding guidelines, we are proposing the following changes. Adding language to the document to reflect that funding policies are statutorily required and must be jointly created. Previously, we had language stating that the systems should develop a funding policy, but it is now state law. Adding language noting that beginning September 1st, 2025, funded ratios are a factor towards triggering an FSRP. And proposing adding language supporting intergenerational equity and contribution smoothing. We are also proposing adding language limiting the duration of negative amortization by adding stipulation that says funding policies should include 2 reasonable target dates that don't change year to year. So one would be when the system begins to reduce their unfunded liability, and the other one is when that UAL would be eliminated. The guidance for helping systems create a funding policy has also several proposed changes. Like the funding guidelines, we are adding in language that reflects changes in statute, and we're also adding in information incorporating FSRP requirements. The major difference between the updated guidance and the past guidance is that this new draft now has examples from Texas funding policies, whereas before we mainly had to use funding policies from other states just because that was what was available. We've added in new sections to the guidance, which includes information for helping systems plan when they're overfunded, not just for underfunding. We are also proposing to encourage the periodic review and revision of funding policies independent of an FSRP. We've also expanded on risk sharing by adding in more information on how both the system and the sponsor can implement formal risk sharing policies. So next month, we will be making the draft guidelines and guidance available for public comment. In March, we will provide an update to the board on the project status, and we will revise the example funding policy in April, and then bring those documents and the stakeholder comments to the actuarial committee meeting in May. We project that the project will be completed in July. At that time, we will present the final guidance, guidelines, and example policy to the board for final. And that concludes my presentation. Mr. B and I are happy to take any questions on updates to either document.
Ms. Miller, what is the force what is the enforcement of either set of guidelines? There's no requirement of the plan has to follow our guidelines, is that correct?
We do not have a hard enforcement mechanism.
And how are plans using this help now? They generally follow them or not?
At this time, I don't know. We've done it on a full study to see if each plan is fully adherent to what they've laid out their funding policies. But David may be able to comment on that a little bit more based on what we see in the babies.
I would say anecdotally, I've had actuaries remark to me that in their conversations with their clients, that their clients have brought up the guidelines when they've been discussing what their contributions will
And so, but there is no enforcement, the fact that there are 4 plans outstanding have not contributed a funding policy, we don't have. What do? We just report that to the legislature that they're out of compliance.
Yes, and we do our best to contact them and get in touch with them to request that they submit those documents similar to any other reporting requirements they may be not in compliance with. But yeah, at this time, we do not have a hard enforcement mechanism to enforce either the guidelines.
And again, you know, there was something in the current funding guidance about contributions to the unfunded should be a decreasing amount. But we know it's not always the case as a percentage of pay. And you know, again, we can't enforce that, but I think we should be highlighting issues like that. I also would like to see, and I think you built it into some questions, designing funding policy about the role of employee contributions. And again, as we discussed in previous board, previous actuarial meetings, again, I feel very uncomfortable when I see that member contributions are approaching total funds. And so I really think there needs to be some discussion about the appropriate role of employee contributions.
Are you suggesting, Ms. Dutch, that principle be incorporated somewhere in the
Into the
policy?
fund, to the funding guide.
Something along the lines that the employee contribution should not exceed the normal cost, or should be or less than the normal cost, something like that?
Well, yeah, I don't really know. I think that would have to be fleshed out. Now, I know there are some actuaries who say that, you know, maybe members underpaid for their benefits in prior years because of very high actuarial interest rates, things like that. So there's reason to be charging members, and my comeback to that would be the person you hire tomorrow who's going to be paying that high rate, you know, didn't underpay in the prior years, you know, and they're having to contribute, you know, way beyond. They're not getting much of an employer benefit. So I don't know exactly how you would do it, whether you set up a contribution differences by generation or whatever, but to me, there's got to be some sort of discussion of an appropriate role. And again, it, you know, differs between those who have Social Security protection and those who don't. I mean, they're not paying the 6.45 to Social Security. 6.2.
So we have an opportunity to, would it be appropriate for members of this committee to provide input to the staff between now and the time the board hears this? So there's an opportunity, and I expect these.
Okay.
I appreciate your. Other questions or comments on this? Ms. Levy, any questions or comments on this?
My only comment is maybe a universal comment to some of the changed language to the guidelines itself. When it talks about, you know, the responsibility of each sponsor and the governmental entity adopting a written funding policy. And I don't know if it's just adopt the written funding policy, but just something to indicate that they're adopting the same policy. It is not that they each have to adopt a separate policy.
Okay, well, I would encourage members of the committee, if you have other thoughts or specific suggestions, please direct them to staff before they go to the full board. Appreciate the direction. This is continued improvement of the support document.
And I also wanted to just remind the committee members too that we're planning to send out to stakeholders after this, not right after this meeting, but probably next week.
So get our comments in sooner rather than later.
I mean, if you can, yes, that would be helpful, because we could incorporate things into the drafts and then send them out and then get comment on those suggestions.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of thought and work has gone into this. Oh, it's good stuff, you know. There are not really any entities like the PRB around the country, and this is kind of stuff that I hope that other states and their stakeholders who look at this material are really excellent. Thank you. Thank you all. There's nothing else on that. We are on to item 9 with Mr. Fee, update on research assistance authorized under Texas Government Code, Chapter 810 that offer 100% lump sum options. Mr. Fee, floor is yours.
David Few, staff actuary, here presenting item 9. So due to our concerns that some members receiving lump sums were not getting an equitable distribution of benefits, in July I presented preliminary research on systems offering complete pension cash outs. And this is a follow-up after requesting additional information from those systems. So today we're going to go over the methodology we use to populate these lists, a list of systems that offer complete cash outs, the basics of actuarial equivalence, the assumptions used to calculate the lump sums, the assumptions used by those systems to calculate their liabilities, and then a comparison of those side by side. Now we'll look at sample lump sum calculations to understand the importance of these assumptions, and we're going to look at their administrative practices involving how well members and their spouses are informed. Methodology, we requested and received the latest plan documents from each special district purpose plan. We identified the key plan provisions, including when are the lump sums offered, what interest rate is used to calculate the lump sums, and what mortality table is used. We asked follow-up questions, including what were the take rates of the lump sums, did these systems participate in Social Security, and what were their administrative practices. These responses were self-reported. They were not verified by the PRB. Some responses came from the actuary, some from the plan administrators. Some responses required interpretation by me. But overall, I would say we have a useful picture of lump sum practices among Texas public pension systems. So looking at systems that offer complete cash outs, we've added columns for the 2022 take rates and also Social Security participation. So there are 12 out of 34 plans offering full lump sum options at termination, and 11 out of them offering the lump sums at retirement. So when you look at the take rates that we've added, if you see 0% or 100%, there likely were very few employees who were actually offered the lump sum that year. The main ones with the most credibility are the 3 largest systems. So CPS Energy with 2,900 employees had a take rate of 24%. JPS with 4,000 employees had a take rate of 46% for terminations and 29% for retirements. And University Health System with 7,000 employees had a take rate of 14% for terminations and 18% for retirements.
This does not include the fact that, among many plans that have a number of contributions, if they leave before they're vested, they can get refunded contributions. So we're not considering that as a lump sum.
No, this is only if they can get 100% of their benefit as expressed as an annuity they had accrued, converted to a lump sum.
Good, thank you.
So looking at the basics of actual equivalence, to convert a member's monthly benefit into an optional lump sum, systems need a way to determine an equivalent benefit so that there's no loss to the system. So there's 2 components to that. There's an interest rate and a mortality table. The interest rate works just like a mortgage. So if you have a $3,000 monthly payment you can put toward a house, if interest rates are lower, you can afford a larger, more expensive house. Likewise, if an employee has a $3,000 monthly annuity from a pension, if a lower interest rate is used to calculate their lump sum, they're going to receive a higher lump sum. So the system assumes the retiree will earn a lower return, they're going to be offered a larger lump sum so that it's the same value as a smaller lump sum with a higher expected return. Now looking at mortality tables, if you use a more modern table, there's going to be more expected payments over a longer expected lifetime. And so that way you have a larger lump sum as compared to an outdated mortality table. So these are the assumptions being used to convert annuities into lump sums. The interest rates you can see range all the way from treasury rates up to 8.5%. And the mortality tables range back from 1971 up to 2023. So now looking at valuation assumptions, these are the system's best estimate assumptions being used in the actuarial valuation reports. And here we see much more convergence. The interest rates range only from 5.75% to 7%, and the mortality tables range from 2010 to 2014. So it'd be nice to see similar convergence in the lump sum assumption. So now we're looking at the interest rates side by side between the lump sums and the actual valuation. And the interest rates marked in red, for those systems, their best estimate for their professionally managed portfolio returns were less than they assumed when they were calculating lump sums. We did have 4 systems in green, Colorado River, Irving Supplemental, Lower Colorado River, and Lower Neches Valley, all use lump sum interest rates similar to their best estimates in their valuation. One interesting one was CPS Energy. They took our concern seriously and looked into their practices, and they found that for their terminated employees, they actually received a greater of 2 calculations. One, the traditional converted annuity into a lump sum, and 2, their contributions with a guaranteed interest rate converted in an interesting way. And so what they found is that if they lowered their lump sum interest rate, when that second version won, the lump sum would actually be lower. And so they were looking into what makes sense for them.
If I'm not mistaken, CPS is by far the biggest of these in terms of the number of plan participants. Does that sound about right?
CPS is the 3rd largest.
In the group?
Yeah, University Health is the largest, JPS is the 2nd largest, and CPS Energy is the 3rd largest.
Thank you.
And the University Health is a frozen fund.
For what we're talking about, yes, because they converted their newer hires go into a cash balance plan.
Oh, so other people are still accruing?
Yes, there are still people accruing benefits under grandfather.
Okay, so it's in membership is frozen, benefits are not frozen.
That is correct. Here we have a comparison of the mortality tables between the valuation and the lump sums. And you see we only have 3 systems in green, Irving Supplemental, Lower Colorado River, and Lower Neches Valley, where they have updated the lump sum mortality within the last decade. And the other ones range back to 1971. Most common, I would say, are 1983, 1984.
Now, it's my understanding, if we were operating in corporation, the IRS sets the requirements as to how to calculate a lump sum.
Yes, the mortality table gets updated every year. And the interest rates are based on high quality corporate bonds.
So, but we, in the state, for these plans, we are not subject to IRS.
No, they're not subject to any requirements. So now looking at sample lump sum calculations, this will show the effect these assumptions have. So I've concentrated on the systems using 1983, 1984 mortality, since that was the most common. So for systems used, we have 5 systems using 83 to 84. And on average, their valuation interest rate was 8%. And on average, their lump sum interest rate was 6.6%. So looking at the box at the top for age 65 retirements, using their current lump sum assumptions, the $3,000 monthly annuity would result in a lump sum of under $300,000. But if they were to update the assumptions to be similar to their valuation assumptions, which are their best estimates, that same $3,000 pension would result in a lump sum over $400,000. And looking below at an age 45 terminating employee, a $500 monthly annuity using the average lump sum assumptions results in a lump sum under $9,000. But if you updated the assumptions, it would result in a lump sum more than double at almost $19,000. So this is a new slide on administrative practices. So here, these administrative practices do not affect the benefit amount, but they affect the level of information provided to the member and spouse. So when we talk about relative value language, for a corporate plan, the IRS mandates that they disclose the value of all options. So the election paperwork for a lump sum worth 80% of the annuity would actually have that 80% figure in front of the participant when they were making their election. Texas public pension systems have no such requirement, but some systems do at least disclose the possibility that the lump sum might be less in value. They don't usually say what that difference in value is, but they at least have language that alerts the member that it may be different value. So we marked yes if they at least did that. For spouse approval, when a member chooses an option under which the spouse will not benefit after the participant's death, many systems require the spouse to be notified and sign off on it. But not all do, and you can see we have 4 systems that do not require spouse approval. So now looking at the summary, we have 3 systems using the best practice assumptions for lump sums. We have another 3 systems using the best administrative practices. And overall, when you combine it, we have 2 systems using the best practices for both lump sum assumptions and administrative practices. So given that we only have 2 out of 12 using what we would determine to be the best practices, we would consider drafting guidance for these systems. So for next steps, we'd like to share the results with the respondents. We'll report these research findings at a future full board meeting, and then potentially, if directed, draft lump sum guidance.
Questions, Mr. P? Questions for Mr. P?
I don't necessarily have a question, but my comment, I go back to, why are we discussing this at the PRB level? And I think it goes back to our charge, not only to make sure that the plans are funded in an actuarially sound manner, but there's also a requirement that we review the equitable distribution of benefits. And to me, this speaks to the equitable distribution of benefits. And again, knowing how complex, most people are not familiar with present value or how a mortgage will be, surprisingly how a mortgage works. But this is a complex area, and people tend to think that a lump sum is worth a lot more than it really is sometimes. And I guess I totally support there being more information provided to members about the lump sum choice, particularly in very volatile economic times, very volatile markets, which I think we'll be seeing for the next foreseeable future.
Thanks for those comments. I appreciate the next steps. I think those are appropriate, good, appropriate. Ultimately, I, as one member of this board, I could support notifying these individuals if we were to get the votes on the board, that this is something that concerns this board. This is an issue of major inequity in certain circumstances, and I think that it ought to be well publicized to the point that these systems that are doing it, once they know about it, it's nice to bring transparency to it. I think that if transparency doesn't bring about the appropriate change, I think that we should be considered.
Yes, just one
That's
more
fine.
question. Is my recollection correct that plans don't have to provide lump sums, correct? These are just plans that are choosing to provide lump sums?
Right. We have roughly 100 Texas public pension systems, and really don't see complete lump sums offered outside of these special district plans under 810. And so there's 34, I believe, of these plans, and 12 of them offer complete lump sum. We do have many other systems that maybe offer 50% lump sum. They can take half their annuity is converted to a lump sum, but then the other half would remain an annuity, things like that. we didn't include those here. These are just systems where the member can take their full benefits lump sum and they have nothing more coming to them. And for that, there's 12 systems.
And if a system chose not to provide a lump sum after they previously provided it, how would they effectuate pension? Is that something that can just be made at the system level, or is that something like a benefit change that would require a member?
I have to look into that further, but I would think that would be considered a benefit change. And, you know, it would be difficult to take that benefit away from members who already are entitled to that. But for future members, you could certainly change the option. Or you could, for benefits already accrued, you know, they've already accrued a benefit and you know, under a plan where a lump sum is an option.
Okay. I think my concern or the point on this that I would like to vocalize is I agree with what's been previously stated. I think that there has to be more transparency associated with how these calculations are being made and what the economic impact of those calculations are. I am concerned that, you know, providing this guidance, or we may make it, or the new guidelines may have such a financial impact on these systems that they're no longer able to provide lump sums for their participants. And there are situations in which it could be in the participant's best interest to take a lump sum, even if they're taking the lump sum at the lesser value. So I just really would like to be mindful of that as we move forward.
That's a fair point, but when you're giving somebody half actuarially what they're entitled, you're generating an actuarial gain at their expense too. That's not operating, that's not performing your fiduciary duty. Like, you're not operating in the best interest. Just not giving them a fair deal.
I think to Ms. Lavy's point, on average, that is what's happening. But as an example, if a member knew they only had a year to live before they took their benefit, then a lump sum would be in their best interest. Even if it was only worth half the value of an annuity for on average, a lump sum would be worth more than the annuity for that person.
Well, sure, but you know, we're not in the business of deciding what benefits. And if a plan or a system wants to decide we don't want to provide a certain benefit, that is up to them. But if they're going to make the decision to provide benefit, it ought to be fair. It's not fair to provide a benefit and then say, you know, we're going to provide this benefit, and then we're going to jip you.
Especially when members have very little
They don't know.
ability to understand that they're being gypped. You know, that to me is the issue here, is that this is complex enough that people don't understand it.
I'm going to assume that the reason this is happening basically is tonight. There's not anybody out there bringing their hands to keep these factors the way they can. Actually, because I doubt it's that big, but actually, it would have that much actually impact on the system. Anyway, and I suspect just some transparency on change all of those things.
Basically, 3 levels of, you know, actions we can take. You know, one is just listing guidance, which amounts to best practices. One is guidelines, which is a little more, you know, you should do this, and one would be statutory changes. And right now we're talking about guidance, you know, so yeah.
Yeah, I'll bet that goes a long way. Other comments or questions? Thank you very much for your work. Well, I guess we'll see what's before meeting. Future meetings, agenda items, dates, locations, and other arrangements. Next actuarial committee meeting will take place May 9th, 10 a.m. Patient TBD. The next pension review board meeting will take place March 6th, 10 a.m. Location TBD. And if there's no further business or no objection, I move to adjourn this meeting. Can someone please second? Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.